Good evening, everyone. For those I've not had the chance to meet here, my name is John Highbush. I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation, and I just want to thank all of you for joining us here this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedom around the world, if you would please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks very much. Please be seated. Well, I'm not sure about you, but I know that I, along with probably several here, struggled for example, in high school, with difficult questions such as, well, what's my favorite beer? Or maybe you went on to college and you had to struggle with what fraternity or sorority you might pledge to. Our guest tonight, however, knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life from a young age. He got his start in journalism at the tender age of 18. He started out at KGUN-TV in Tucson, Arizona, and from there went a long way. He went on to become NBC's chief White House correspondent for 8 years during the Bush 43 presidency. And as every diehard political junkie knows, David Gregory was the host of NBC's Meet the Press for 6 years, every Sunday morning following that time. Given he is instantly recognizable around the world from his many years as a top-flight news reporter and anchor, when he comes out with a book, one expects it to be all about politics and the news. But this one, entitled, "How's Your Faith?" is somewhat unexpected. So let's turn to a quote from our 40th president, Ronald Reagan, for some context. President Reagan once said, quote, "Let us take up the challenge to reawaken America's religious and moral heart, recognizing that a deep and abiding faith in God is the rock upon which this great nation was founded." We're here tonight because of the religious and moral heart of our guest. As it turns out, a handful of years ago, David Gregory was asked one simple question by then President George Bush: "How's your faith?" I said it was a simple question, but for many, there might not be a simple answer. It's a soul-searching question that can spark, or in this case, accelerate a spiritual journey. And that's just what it did for our guest, David. The question took David inside the Christian megachurches and into the heart of Orthodox Judaism. He went to Bible study. He spoke with evangelical preachers. He spoke to the Catholic Archbishop of New York. And that journey inevitably led him to a better understanding of his own Jewish faith, so poignantly described in his book. Before David comes up, I just want to say that it has been one of my lifelong ambitions to be interviewed by David. Now, as you would know or expect, to be interviewed by David Gregory would mean that one has certainly arrived and that you had something important to say. I have to say with great humility that that day still has not arrived for me. Instead, I am here interviewing David. There's some irony in that, but I am honored either way. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library, Mr. David Gregory. Great to have you, please.
I might just tell you.
Okay, take your time.
All right. I had a little technical malfunction here. Thankfully, I'm a professional and I can quickly handle this.
David, welcome to the Reagan Library.
Thank you.
Just a true honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Yeah, and when you say to be back, I know you've been to the library before, but in part, your youth was spent out here. I know you spent a lot of time in New York City as a young fellow, but you were raised here in many respects, right?
I was, yeah. I mean, I grew up here, not far from here, and some of my original neighbors are here from growing up in Tarzana, and born and bred in the San Fernando Valley. Went to Birmingham High School, so yeah. I mean, this is really home.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, I've now lived in Washington longer than I ever lived here, but that just means I'm getting older.
You know, as I was saying in your introduction, the book's called How's Your Faith, with a question mark behind it. And then the subtitle is An Unlikely Spiritual Journey. Yeah. And I wondered if you could explain to our audience, particularly for those who may not have read the book yet, but will buy it this evening, what should we take from the meaning of it's an unlikely spiritual journey?
Well, first of all, let me just welcome everybody here and thank you all for showing up. And it's also a great honor to have my mother, Carolyn Surtees, here in the front row, which is very sweet. My mother can deliver a lot of people. I got her a gift card to a bookstore in Pasadena so that she can keep buying copies of the book just to keep. I think it's unlikely for a couple of reasons. I mean, first, I just want to say by way of introduction, I mean, to me, the point of the book is it's a story of my return to faith as an adult and my efforts to deepen my own faith. And then it's really about, I think, the spiritual journeys that people go on in their lives. For me, I call it unlikely because, you know, growing up in this area, Jewish, like I think a lot of Jews in America, I grew up with a deep sense of identity and cultural identity being Jewish, but without deep belief. I think that's particularly true. I mean, of course, that's true among Christians too. There are cultural Christians, but particularly among Jews, and the way I grew up, it's not true across the board, but it was just kind of unlikely that I would get to a point in my life where, as I describe it, I really did feel a kind of spiritual longing, you know, a desire to really get to the essence of who I was and to try to answer what I think are the big questions of the journey of life, which is who am I and who is it I'm trying to become. So I think the way I grew up, without deep faith and without deep belief, it did seem rather unlikely that I would go on to work at big establishment media and to work in, you know, some of the great cities of America that are pretty secular, you know, namely Washington, D.C., and then find myself along this, what I think is a very meaningful path for me.
Yeah. Do you see any similarity, David, between the questioning you were doing for yourself and what might be happening across America? You know, I know the Pope is about to be visiting the United States, and as he visits from the standpoint of Catholics, it looks like, you know, there's more and more a pulling away from the faith. There are fewer people that are attending Mass, whether here or in Ireland or some of the other strongholds for the Catholic faith. So, but whether you're Muslim, Catholic, Jewish, Protestant, what have you, it seems to me there's this angst in society about people and where they stand vis-a-vis their faith. Do you think we're experiencing that as a nation?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of levels to that. On one level, I think, you know, you read the quote from Reagan, which I find so stirring, and I think it's so deeply embedded in what it is to be American, to have great faith in God and believe in what America represents. But we also know that religion in the public square, religion in politics, can be divisive. If you invoke big policy questions around the faith, you can get ideological split, you can get religious splits. And I really think that one of the struggles that religion faces is that people are more skeptical about religion. They're more fragile in their inherited faith. And yet, you hear more and more desire for spirituality, or more of a sense of spiritual longing. So people talk about spirituality versus religion. I think that's a difficulty. I think there are a lot of problems with organized religion. I think it turns a lot of people off. There's doctrine, there's ideology, there's a sense of acceptance and relevancy. I mean, I love the Pope because I just feel like he is a great example of moral conscience in the world. I mean, I think he bears witness to a faith, which is, as a Jew, I believe in, the tenet of our faith is that you should treat the stranger as yourself, for we were once strangers in the land of Egypt. I think he models that. I mean, the act of the Pope, head of this huge Catholic church, who's washing someone's feet. Now, I've not done this, but I actually would like to do it. And I think it is such an act of humility. And in the Gospels, when Jesus is washing Peter's feet, and Peter looks back kind of askance and says, "What are you doing? Why would you do that?" And Jesus says, "You will come to understand why this is so important to do." I think there's a longing for any voice of conscience that says to any of us, and I speak for myself, "Hey, I'm knocking at the door, are you listening? Is God at work in your life, and are you hearing? And are you slowing down enough to open your heart to be open to a message, however you understand God, or however that manifests itself in your life?" I don't preach about that. That's not my gig. But I just talk about it in terms of my own path.
Yeah. Once the title of the book, "How's Your Faith?" In reading the book, it becomes apparent that President Bush, 43, seemed to ask you that a few times during the course of your relationship with him as when he was president. But I think you were already asking yourself that question, right? So you were already on a spiritual journey before he was prompting you.
Yeah, I mean, people ask really where it came from. I had a friend at NBC who said, I've never encountered somebody who went on this spiritual path for no apparent reason. And really, I was in a place in my life where I felt so grateful for my life, for my success. I was kind of on the ascent at NBC, and I was so grateful for my marriage and my 3 kids, and I felt like what more is expected of me? How do I express gratitude? And at a time when Beth, my wife, and I were raising young kids, and she's Christian, and we were going to be a Jewish family, but she challenged me with this idea of, if you're going to lead us in faith, lead us on a spiritual path, and you have to really know it. I felt a desire to understand, well, what does it mean to be Jewish? If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to lead in this path, have I answered the question for myself? How do I live with a real sense of meaning and purpose? So when I went down that road, I then had several encounters where he asked me. He'd heard from a mutual friend that I was studying Bible with a teacher, an Orthodox scholar named Erica Brown in Washington. And notably, when I got the job at Meet the Press, I remember coming in to the Oval Office, and the president was standing there, and he said, "Stand up straight, girls, here he is, Meet the Press." And we talked a bit about the economy, and he talked about the public scrutiny that can come with the job I was entering into. But then he asked me, "How's your faith?" And I had told him that I was trying to better connect with the Christian traditions of my wife. I thought it could only make me a better husband and father, and I was trying to deepen my spiritual path. And he talked about his own path. And one of the things that I really respected about, and do respect about President Bush, is that, his own faith journey was one that was really a personal journey of transformation, of deepening his own faith and achieving some mastery over himself, which was very important to him. It helped him deal with his drinking at age 40 and transformed his life. And, between 40 and 55, there was a lot of work he did there, and quite a result, becoming President of the United States.
Yeah, the fact that the book is drawn from the question that he asked you, it brings to mind the concern at the time, I remember, from several quarters about the fact that, perhaps President Bush was wearing his faith too much on his sleeve, and, was his decision-making tied, to, his faith so strongly that perhaps, in some way it might negatively influence the outcome of his decisions.
Right.
Did you sense that, as you covered him so closely?
Well, I was acutely aware of the criticism, and I think there are some who really oppose President Bush and his policies, or a sense of certainty that he might have in the world, who believe that he practices a messianic form of Christianity and that God told him to invade Iraq. That's never held much water with me. I remember, notably, he was interviewed by Bob Woodward, and Woodward asked him, "Do you seek advice from your father?" And he says, "I have a higher father that I appeal to." And people also criticized that as if that was somehow, that God was instructing him. I never understood that criticism. I asked Tony Blair in this book, who was so close, is a deep man of faith, and was very close, as you know, with President Bush. And I said, how do you separate these things out as a leader? You're a rich interior life from the duties of public leadership. And he said, look, it's not like you go into the corner and pray and ask God whether you should raise the minimum wage. He said, you're praying for strength, for the courage of your convictions, for comfort. And I think people get that. Wherever you are in terms of your relationship with God, I think people understand that faith-filled people are looking for that kind of guidance. And I very much feel that that's what Bush was about. And I think there is a desire, President Bush said this. I asked him, I said, do you think people have misinterpreted your faith? He said, there are people who think that perhaps I make irrational decisions, or that I think I'm better than they are. And that's really important because, this is something that I try to address in the book. I think faith is really hard, and I get it wrong all the time. And sometimes, even when I was really upset and disappointed about leaving NBC, I didn't feel like my faith held me all the time. But I keep trying to get better. I keep trying to work it. And the thing I do believe about God and about a path of faith is that, that's what it's about. It's not about getting there. It's not about perfection. It's about aspiration. And it's knowing that when we keep stumbling, because we're human beings, that God is close. In joy and pain and in personal failure, God is close. So it's a bit kind of a long answer to say, I think Bush had his own path. I think people disagreed with it. I think there's lots of people who have an interesting relationship with faith and our leaders. They expect our leaders to be people of faith, but then they get really nervous when they start acting on their faith principles, because that gets into the realm of areas where should government be involved and where shouldn't it, and that's one of the great debates.
Yeah. Now, you touched on this before, but I want to force you to go back to it because I just found it so stunning. When people are confronted with a crisis or some tragedy in their lives, it seems to me that's usually the time when, I'm oversimplifying this, but they find God or they get a renewed relationship. Not at all the case in your situation. It just seems like you were on a rocket ship kind of a path, doing incredibly well in your career. You had a great family, great marriage, everything just rolling your way. And in the middle of that, to stop and say, I'm going to ask myself some tough questions.
Yeah.
It just seems very unusual, did it?
Well, again, I was kind of coming, it's interesting. I had lots of interesting experiences as a nice Jewish boy from the Valley. To be sitting at Lakewood Church with Joel Osteen, who I think is terrific. And I said, he said to me, I think you had and have a void that a lot of people experience. And in your quiet time when you call out to God, he said, I do believe that God reveals himself to people like that. So I think for me it was a combination of that, of things, really kind of in gratitude, but also really wanting to take responsibility of the Jewish path of my family and really trying to understand what it meant for me to be there. And even, the more I learned about Judaism, the more I studied the Bible and did these things, Cardinal Dolan made the observation. He said, there's still a danger when you're doing that you can treat a faith journey as something of a project. And he said, but it's not a project. In the end, it's an act of love. It's a dare. And it's taken me a long time to get to that place of openness, to see it really as that, and to stop working so hard and thinking about it so hard, to kind of get out of my head and really open my heart. And I still mess that up all the time. But that's the path I try to keep myself on.
For those in the audience or around the world that may not know you, what they know of you, they see through the prism of a television set.
Right.
Like somewhat, as I said in my introduction, their expectation is, well, David Gregory is going to he's going to write if he writes a book, it's going to be a bestseller about how the news media really works, or a kiss and tell book about President Bush or what have you. Yet that's not what you turned to. And I wonder if that was kind of surprising to you, that you didn't pick the conventional route, or explain why
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, that's not what I was moved to do. I didn't really feel like I had great standing to write that kind of a book. I was influenced always by Tom Brokaw and Tim Russert, and when they decided to write books, Tom wrote it about World War II veterans, of course, The Greatest Generation, and Tim wrote about his father. And it wasn't about them. So, I am writing about myself in a way that it kind of puts myself out there, but I ultimately hope it's about you. I mean, I hope it's about all of us. This is something that's touched my life very deeply, and I feel like this is me turning my journalistic curiosity to the biggest journey of life. This question of who are we trying to be, and I'm asking these questions of myself, and also asking the questions to really smart, thoughtful people in the faith community who offered me wonderful advice. I've done lots of interviews. I've never had the experience that I've had, whether Joel Osteen or other religious figures, where I can just sit down and talk about the faith path and kind of see where that conversation goes. It was deeply satisfying.
Yeah, it's in reading, the way you wrote the book. It looks like you had. Might not have been an easy task, but it was something enjoyable.
It was fun.
It was a real discovery.
Yeah.
There's some self-confession in the book. It seems like there's a thread throughout your chapters about, what you perceive as your own shortcomings, and of the few that you have. The one you seem to put your finger on a number of times was this. These moments of anger, these times when you lose your patience or temper, and I saw a few times where it looked to me like you were attempting to figure out, well, what was the source of this anger? Whether it might show up in some small way, because you're angry somebody parked their car where yours might have been, or what have you. But have you thought about where it stems from? Is there something in your childhood? I don't want you on the couch here, but I think you.
I didn't hold a whole lot back from the book, so I wouldn't blame you. Look, I mean, I think it's just who I am. My dad has really struggled with his temper his whole life, and I was afraid of my dad growing up. And I think one of I've been humbled by a number of things in my life and career. One of those things was to say to myself, well, I am not going to make the same mistakes that my parents made with me. I am just not going to do those things. And then to discover that I made some of those exact same mistakes with my own children. I mean, nothing kicks you in the behind like that, where you say, wait a minute, I was hoping to screw them up in an entirely different and novel way. I had this experience with my son who's now 13, and he's about 6 years old, and I was angry with him, and I grabbed him by the arm, and I don't know, about an hour later, he was on the top bunk in his room, which he shared with his younger brother. And he said to me, Daddy, when you're angry with me like that, I would rather you, give me some kind of consequence. I really don't like when you grab me like that. And I was, of course, devastated and embarrassed and guilt-ridden, and thought, how could I do that? Why would I make the same kind of mistake where I might frighten him the way that I was frightened? And then, so then I was, certainly humbled by that. I kind of sat back against his dresser. And then I was just shocked that he would say that to me, because I would have never said that to my father. And in a way, I was really heartened that he felt safe enough with me and close enough to me that he could say that to me. And I apologized, and we moved on. And it wasn't the last time that I had to apologize or that I lost control. So I think it comes from just being who I am. I think it comes from a lack of self-control and self-mastery. And one of the things I've done in my Jewish studies, I think there's a lot of people, including Jews, who don't know that, a lot of medieval Jewish philosophers could have been Tony Robbins in their day. They wrote books. There's one book called Path of the Just, which I study, which is about your personal characteristics and managing personal characteristics. One of them is a whole chapter just about how to deal with anger. So it's fascinating. So I've studied that and try to get a handle on it. Again, I don't have mastery over it. I try to pause. Something from Psalms, which talks about keeping God before you always, and it's not just God, but it's my family, and if that can create some room for me to pause before I act or pause before I react, I think that can help me. And there are times when I get that right, and I keep trying.
Great. Shift gears for just a minute. As I was saying in the introduction, you knew what you wanted to do, I think, from the time you were 11. And you made a point of noting that you used to sit back and study very carefully the Peter Jenningses of the world and Tom Brokaw. And I know you even have an imitation of Tom.
I do.
Feel free to use it at any moment. But for anyone who may be here tonight, maybe they haven't read your book, but they've watched your career from the standpoint of advice for those that are thinking about entering into the media space. Is there, is the lesson, well, start when you're 10 and focus on it, or what would be your advice?
Well, the advice has gotten a lot harder because even at my, what I hoped would still be my tender age, it's changed a lot. But I think you have to become a master of the new direction of the media. I think how dynamic it is. I think one of the things that's happening in media is that content certainly matters, and personalities matter, brands matter, but platforms don't matter as much. They can, in the case of big platforms like a New York Times, for example, but the landscape has shifted to where people will find the content that they really like, and so I think that part's important. I'll tell you a story about Bush and Brokaw and Ronald Reagan. Only two of which were present because I played the role of two others. So I asked President Bush, when Tom Brokaw retired, I asked President Bush and his team if I was going to do a video for Tom. And my gag was that I would interview Bush as Brokaw. And I wrote up a script. And some of Bush's guys looked at it and they're like, we don't think this is appropriate. We're not going to do this. Anyway, and then I get back to him and they're like, he'll do it. And he memorized it. So we're there in the Rose Garden. And so the gag was that I'm interviewing him and I'm so Bush hates to be interrupted. And Brokaw, will talk about all his experiences and drop all these big names. So we walk into the Rose Garden together and Bush says, well, Tom, thanks for coming. Of course, you had a lot of really great memories here. Well, Mr. President, thank you very much. Of course, this is not about me, but I do remember being, of course, I've been to the Reagan Library a time or two, and I actually told Nancy at the time, I said, what you do not want to do is be in a kind of nondescript building somewhere. You want to have Ronnie get a view of the ocean. But I was telling the President Bush, I said, Mr. President, I don't want to interrupt you, but of course I do have a few memories here. This is really about you, but I do remember when President Reagan was here and he saw me in the Rose Garden for the first time, he said, well, Brokaw, looks like things turned out pretty well for the both of us. So I guarded that tape, thank you. I guarded that tape so zealously, only to have Brokaw call, and they played it at Tom's going away party, which I actually couldn't go to because I was here for my dad's 70th birthday. They played it, and everybody thought it was great. And I thought, oh, we cannot what if this tape gets out somehow? This is going to be a disaster. So then Brokaw calls me and he said, hey, do you have that tape? I'm giving a speech somewhere, and I'd like to play it. I said, Tom, you can't let this thing out. And now I've left NBC, so I actually can't tell you where the tape is. But at this point, everybody's good with it. Bush and Brokaw and everybody else. So there you go.
That's neat. You deal with this topic a little in the book, and I almost was a moment where I was like cringing, not wanting to be in the room, but it was at this moment in time when you were doing this fabulous imitation of Tom Brokaw, and he had heard about it from a distance.
Yeah.
And then once you tell the story of...
Well, I was in an afternoon meeting with the nightly news team, and they made me come up and do the imitation, but I didn't know Tom that well. And he just and I did the imitation, and he just had this straight look, just didn't smile. And he wrote me in those days, on the computer, the internal computer system for NBC News, you could do a top screen, kind of like a text message in an earlier iteration. And he just wrote me, and it just said, remember, your career is in my hands. So, which was funny, but kind of horrifying at the same time.
Okay, the other that you imitated there was President Bush.
Yeah.
And you made a point, President Bush made the point, frankly, but you emphasized on it, and that is that his turning towards faith was, it looked to me, in some respects tied to his just being fed up with his own alcoholic tendencies.
Yeah.
So I wondered, what's your takeaway from that? Did you feel like, I don't know, again, it's another instance where a crisis or some sort of potential tragedy in one's life drives you to turn towards faith, and here was our own president, embracing that.
Yeah, well, I think that's right, and I think for him, I think he did. I mean, it's interesting because Billy Graham on that, walk that they took together told him, the Bible is not a self-help book. It is the Word of God, and that's how it should be viewed. Nevertheless, I think he views it as more of, kind of character refinement. There's a rabbi who I study who refers to the Torah as refinement of character. So, no, I think I think that was important. I think for him it was created a sense of longing and a desire for change and transformation in his own life. And I identified with that as I write about in the book, and Mom is here, and we've talked about this before. I write about my mother's alcoholism, and she's been sober nearly 30 years now. I don't think 30 years ago, when she hit her low moment, not far from where we're sitting, that we'd be here 30 years later, and so close and talking about all of this. But for me, in a way, my own spiritual journey began with trying to understand a bit of the family dynamic and what went on for me in my teenage years when my mom's drinking hit that low point. And so I identified with that in him. Felt like I could identify a bit with that. And, in those moments, you want to know, that everything's going to be okay, and you don't want to feel so alone. And there is an element of redemption, I think he felt. The redemption to me is a great gift, and I write about my mother giving us a great gift, which is to find something that's broken and then to make it better. That's a gift. Unfortunately, there are so many souls in the world who are broken and stay lost and are not found. And Amazing Grace is a hymn that's so important to President Bush because he, in his own words, he doesn't need me to say it, he does feel like he was lost and then he was found. And that made a tremendous a difference to him in his life.
Yeah. It's apparent in reading your book that the relationship you have with your wife, Beth, that's the center of your life. It's something, it's remarkably satisfying to see you write about it and how you feel about it. And you talk about in the book this moment in time when I guess she reached an accommodation, as it were, when you decided that you wanted your children to grow up Jewish, and yet she was from another faith. And she, I think it seems to me, because of her love for you, made that happen. But then, over time, it looked like what was started as an accommodation maybe really ended up you even entitled the chapter that way, as a real sacrifice.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you'd talk about that.
Yeah, well, so, and it's an interesting story that I write about. Beth and I met because she was part of the team that prosecuted the Oklahoma City bombers. So I met her during the McVeigh case. And it was interesting, she gave the summation that argued for Timothy McVeigh to be executed. And yet her mother's a pacifist and is a person of deep faith, and as is Beth, and grew up in the Methodist Church, and it was very important to her. I think early on she felt, and it was very important to me, that we were a Jewish family. It was just kind of where I was from, and I never really thought that we'd be anything different, frankly. And she gave me this gift, and she made this sacrifice. I don't think she realized what a big sacrifice it would be for her, and I blame myself for being kind of uninformed and selfish. I don't think I fully appreciated what a big deal it is, what a big sacrifice it is to give up the faith traditions that you grew up with, because you not only give it up for your family, you give up the ability to share that with your children. And again, I didn't fully appreciate that. You know, at our synagogue in Washington, our rabbi, Danny Zemel, does this wonderful thing during the high holiday services of Yom Kippur, where he calls all the non-Jewish spouses up and says a blessing for them and thanks them for the sacrifice that they have made. You know, he says it wasn't too long ago when a Jew was someone to be avoided and shunned, and that you would embrace your Jewish partner as your spouse and agree to follow these traditions is really very, very significant. And she thought about it, and I write about this in the book, and she thought, you know, I thought about, well, why did I do this? And she does have some regret because it is painful for her. But she really did it for me as a gift. She felt that I needed it, and she felt it would be good for me and good for our children, and I am still so grateful and humbled by that gift that she gave me and by her graciousness, and understand that it's really not easy. And the interfaith life for interfaith couples of any stripe in America, it's not easy. There is compromise. It's not always a straight path, but I do believe that we've tried to create something that's really lovely as a family practice that really reflects our common values. And so I hope that's hopeful for people, because, you know, in any community you're in, but certainly in the Jewish community, interfaith marriage is a big topic. It's happening in big numbers, and there are a lot of Jews who are very concerned about it because of what it means for the future of the Jewish people. And I respect all of that, but I'm obviously living the life and have made the choices I've made.
Yeah. My final question for you, and then I'd like to turn it to the audience of Be Thinking of One, we'll find you, is about forgiveness. One of your last chapters is called Forgiveness, and I wondered, it was a beautiful topic for you to address. And I wonder if you just talk for a minute about, regardless of what faith one might hold, where do you place forgiveness in terms of importance?
You know, I think it's really important. You know, there's a theological difference as I've studied this between Judaism and Christianity. I remember Cardinal Dolan telling me, God forgives not because of who we are, but because of who He is. Jews actually believe that you atone to God for sins against God, but you must atone to other people for the sins against other people. So I think those are really important. But I just think forgiveness is so central to who we are. I mean, it's said in the Bible. I mean, Jesus says, you know, forgive so that you can be forgiven. I mean, I think it's part of a path of humility. I think about, you know, in the case of my mother, struggles I had with my mother, I think struggles with my father, you know, to just get a little bit older in the world and experience a little bit more and have life deal you some setbacks, and to be a parent and to struggle with mistakes that you made, really got me to a place that I wasn't at before, which is, who am I to judge? You know, I mean, I have made mistakes, both professionally and the way I've treated people, or managing myself, or with my children. It still goes on every day. So, you know, I think it was a Jewish philosopher, and it might have been the 14th century, but that's obscure enough that I don't know if you'll be able to track it down. Who said, you know, be compassionate because everybody's fighting a great battle. Somebody's always dealing with something. You don't know where people are and why, how they've gotten to the place of where they're at. So I think, you know, for me, forgiveness is important. I try to forgive so that I can be forgiven, because I'm the one who needs to be forgiven. And I just think it's really essential.
Questions? If anyone has a question.
By the way, you don't have to be, but just, you know, you're so polite. You don't have to be, you can ask me anything, even if it feels uncomfortable. Yeah. Because if you haven't read the book yet, there's not a lot of holdback, so.
I'm not. As you can see, we have staff in the various aisles, and if you've got a question, please just raise your hand, and all I ask is that you, right here, is that you wait till you get the microphone in your hand so we can hear your question. Thank you.
David, Eva Blazer, it's a great pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
And I am just deeply moved, first of all, about your discussion with your lovely mother, whose privilege I have to know. So it's remarkable. Two, I am here in dual role as someone who is developing California Space Center on Ronald Reagan's land, but also as editor-at-large of the largest Polish weekly.
Yeah.
And this book that I have here with me, I am going to send to President Wałęsa. as a special gift, and also someone who shared so much time with President Reagan.
Yeah.
And something that they also shared, now I know also with you, which is tremendous commitment to faith as the strength that carried them through historical events. In your role as a remarkable TV personality journalist, can you comment on the role of faith in politics and faith as a armor of significant politicians in dealing with the history?
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to meet you. I think, like I said, it plays such an essential role because Americans expect their presidents to be people of faith. And yet, once we get beyond that, then people get very wary, or it just becomes more divisive. You know, are you reflective of religious values if you're the president in an appropriate way? You know, issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, you know, come to mind. Role of government, birth control. On the other side, I think people, and I wish politicians would be more comfortable speaking of their faith in more personal terms, the extent to which it has, their interior life, you know, drives them, and where they find God and how they manage that, you know, relationship, and how it affects their values and how it affects, you know, things they struggle with in the world. And I think there's a deep wariness and insecurity in how politicians talk about faith, because what they're trying to do is touch various constituencies that have very real demands on them as a result of some of these hot-button issues.
Another question, right here.
Yes, David, I enjoyed the discussion. Question, in your quest for faith and your identity with it, where do you come down on radical Muslim terrorism?
I'm against it. You know, I think it can be one of the perversions of religion. I mean, it really can. You know, Jews, Christians, Muslims have all historically been killed in the name of faith. And it's a horrible thing. But I think that all religion can be perverted. I do like, somebody said to me recently about a great bumper sticker, which is, I don't know and you don't know either. So I think there's a fair amount of doubt that we can hold alongside deep conviction. And, you know, the God I know doesn't talk about killing people and killing innocents and so forth. You know, I think that's it's deeply troubling. But I also think that, you know, I believe it's really important that again, this is me. I mean, I'm not any kind of faith leader. I'm just to tell you my own path, which is I'm just deeply moved by seeking peace and by seeking understanding across traditions. I feel very rooted in Judaism. I like to reach out and learn more from others. I spoke to a prominent imam in my book, Majid from Northern Virginia. And I said, Imam, look, I said, I know you've got terrible issues you're dealing with in your community. I mean, he has to worry in his community in Northern Virginia. They have to have classes of young people who are being targeted on media, social media, by jihadists trying to recruit them, and has to talk to these kids about what is Islam and the path that is really called for them religiously. And I said, look, I'm not here to talk to you about radical Islam. That's not my focus. I'm here to talk to you about duties of the heart. And he enjoyed that focus, and there are deeply faithful people in all communities. And I really do think, you know, people ask me, like, you know, what is faith? You know, faith is love. I mean, it's about love. And God asks us to love Him. He loves us, and we're trying to grow in that love and that spirit. And that's where I really spend my time. I mean, I'm very interested in issues and of course, I find it horrifying, issues of terrorism and perversion of religion as a journalist, but as a person of faith, that's where I just try to spend my focus.
I think I saw another question back here, and then we'll come over here.
I'll try to be a little quicker so we can get to more questions.
Yeah.
Okay, so since faith is such a major aspect of your life, have you ever declined or questioned a career opportunity because of your faith?
No, I don't think that's ever come up. No, I mean, I think one of the things that I guess I've tried to do is try to be mindful of, a faith path within my work. In other words, my teacher used to say to me, you're trying to develop your interior life and work on yourself and do all these things, but you can't segregate that from your professional life. You have to try to bring those virtues into your professional life. You need to really think about who do you want to be, how do you want to treat people, how do you want to deal with the toxicity in your business through the realm of faith. So I think that's something I've done, but I've never really been in that position. No.
I think we had another back here, and then we'll come up front.
Thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.
A quick question. A friend of mine, Mike McCurry, fellow Washingtonian, has been going through a faith journey as well. I wondered if you've had any discussions with him.
I haven't, but I'd love to. Mike is Catholic, right? I think he is. Methodist. Okay, excuse me. No, but I'd love to. He's he's a great guy. I didn't cover the Clinton years, so I didn't deal with him, and he never yelled at me. But I was yelled at by other people.
Okay. Here and then here. Okay.
What do you do on a regular, even daily basis to grow, strengthen, challenge your faith?
Thank you. Well, I try to pray a lot, and I try to think about, I kind of try to grow in prayer and develop my practice a little bit more. I really try to root myself in Jewish prayer in terms of daily prayer and morning prayer. But then I like to, and I share this book with my mom, Frederick Buechner, who is a theologian and Christian writer. I like to read his meditations. I read other meditations. I try to study Bible with regularity, and I try to read a lot, and I try to find a moment. A friend of mine, Jim Wallace, the Reverend Jim Wallace, referred to soulful rest. He said, he posted this on social media, where he said, I just sat and watched the sunset and didn't do anything else, and it was just soul rest. So sometimes I just like to cultivate quiet and kind of calm my mind a little bit. So I'm still trying to grow, and I still experiment, but I do try to challenge myself and try to read a lot and try to study and try to keep working on my prayer practice. And I read people. There might be a quote that I share from you at some point by Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest in New Mexico, where I used to work. I didn't know he was there at the time, or else I would have gone and seen him. I read people like that and get a lot of inspiration.
Great. Right here in the middle. There you go.
I'm looking back there. Is that Patsy?
One row back.
Are you Patsy? No. I'm sorry, you look familiar to me. I'm sorry, you look like somebody that would cover the White House with.
You made an earlier reference to spirituality versus religion.
Yeah.
And somewhat following the earlier question, I wondered both in your interviews and then in your own determination, how you found the essence of the importance of religious practice and rituals vis-a-vis your determination now about their importance in the strengthening of faith.
So I'm not certain I understand your question.
When we hear people talk about spirituality,
Yes.
it so frequently differs from routine attendance in religious
I know what you're
services
saying.
and things of that sort.
Well, I think there's this departure for a lot of people. I think people who are uncomfortable with religion, organized religion, say the church or the synagogue, they say, well, no, I'm on a spiritual path. And, that can be and my rabbi describes this as kind of being in relationship with God, where God is present, where God is an inspiration, where God is bearing witness in my life, however you understand God. And, I think it gets caught up, and I deal with this all the time. I mean, look, as a Jew, I'm in the Reform movement. My teacher likes to say I'm post-denominational. But I've certainly made institutional choices in my life that put me in the more progressive Reform camp. I mean, I'm married to a non-Jew. My mother's not Jewish, on and on. I like aspects of ritual rooted in tradition. And I like being rooted in religious practice. And there are some religious practices that work for me and give me meaning and others that don't. I pick and choose, which is a more progressive thing to do within Judaism, and I think we all have experiences with that. So I guess my own view is I believe in and am very fond of a religious rooting. Because I guess there is the Russell Moore, head of the Southern Baptist Convention, he said to me, the concept of journeying can be a kind of a thing where you're always journeying, you're always questioning, but you're never really arriving. And you don't have a moral horizon. I believe in having a moral horizon. I believe in certain expectations of me and so forth. So in that way, I believe in that spiritual path, but it should be rooted in something. So I hope that answers the question, which is, I understand the distinction for people, and I think it's rooted in the idea that people a lot of people are turned off by the expectations of big institutional faith, whatever that may be. And that's where people kind of, set about on their own, what they will call their own spiritual path, which they can define in lots of different ways.
Great. Over here.
Hi, David.
Hello.
A quick question. Do you think that Washington is getting bogged down with the separation of church and state problem?
Well, I think it's really interesting. I think the culture is changing rapidly. So, gay rights is a perfect example of how quickly that's moved. And I think there are some people, although I think fewer than maybe many people expected, are very uncomfortable with that and are thinking, oh, you know what, is there a kind of trampling over religious rights and conscience? I know some people believe that. I'm not really a commentator in this area, so I don't like to opine about it. But I think it's a concern, but I don't know where it really manifests itself. And I think sometimes we get caught up in these arguments that are false arguments. So that Kentucky clerk over the gay marriage issue, I can respect her view religiously, that's fine, but it's irrelevant. She is the government. So the Supreme Court has ruled and if she wanted, if her sense of conscience was so strong, she could have had somebody in her office do it. So I think that's where I just think you get this kind of conflation of these arguments that drive us apart more than pull us together, and I think unnecessarily so. So I think there's always going to be questions of conscience and faith that are rooted in policy. And I'm interested in those journalistically. I pay close attention to them, but I try not to have that, kind of dominate where I am spiritually or religiously.
Another one over here.
Hi, David. My name's Dennis. I used to watch you all the time. I'm a political junkie,
Thank you.
And I live a few blocks from here, so I hang out a lot here. It's a great place.
Awesome. And you got a good ball cap on, too.
That's right. And a native Californian, right? So it's interesting. I haven't read your book. I apologize.
That's all right.
So at the end of the day, what happened? Are you Jewish, Christian, or somewhere in between?
Oh, I'm definitely Jewish. Now, not everybody would consider me Jewish, who's Jewish. What's that? Would not consider me Jewish. There are conservative Jews who wouldn't consider me Jewish, but I don't get too worked up in that. I know I have a legitimate place in Judaism in my heart, and I don't worry about that. So no, I feel very deeply Jewish. And as I said a minute ago, I think where I really am now is that I feel rooted in Judaism, but very inspired and like to reach out to other traditions. I think Judaism has a challenge in that I think a lot of Jews that I know, that I've grown up around, don't like to talk about God. And I love to talk about God. And I think that's central to Judaism. Psalm 27 is all about seeking God's face and having such an intimate relationship with God that the psalmist writes, even if my mother and father were to abandon me, God would gather me in. And yet, Jews don't often talk about God, or they think that's Christianity. So I beg to differ. But I'm inspired by what I think is a spirituality and a relationship with God that's expressed in Christianity that I find inspirational. And by the way, there are big areas of tension that I haven't figured out yet. Somebody says, well, you know, how do you and your wife deal with eternal salvation? And I said, well, first we make sure the kids get to school. And then we'll try to get to eternal salvation. You know, so as a Jew, you know, we're more concerned about the here and now and good deeds on earth and making the most of today. Obviously, Christians believe in the pursuit of eternal salvation, which, you know, Christians believe can only be achieved through Christ. You know, I had Tim Keller, who's a wonderful preacher of the Redeemer Church in New York. He said, I don't think you're giving Christ enough credit for your religious journey. And I said, well, fair enough. I said, you know, you may be right. I mean, I'm just not overly concerned about working out the question yet. And they're like, you know, you don't worry. It could be revealed to you over time. And you know, maybe that truth will be. But yeah, I mean, I know who I am. And I think not just religiously, but you know, I feel very, very strongly about being Jewish. It's who I am. You know, Moses talks about we don't, you know, you're born into the faith. You don't choose it. It chooses you by dint of who you are and where you've come from. And that sense of peoplehood is something that I feel very strongly, even if I have this nice Irish face.
We've got time for one last question. We'll take it right over here. Yeah.
Thank you very much, David. Greatly appreciated your message tonight, and I'm so glad I invited a group of Stephen ministers from our church to hear your message.
Oh, well, thank you.
My question is, you mentioned Frederick Buechner.
Yes.
So there's a great, I think one of his most famous quotes is, where God calls us is the place of our deepest passions, the intersection of our deepest passions and the world's greatest needs. Is that a fantastic quote?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, your deepest passions, the world's greatest needs, where is that for you?
Well, I think it's in a place of understanding what my true identity is. You know, when I lost my job, I had been on television and in television news since I was 18. And at 44, to have a big setback like that was very disappointing and embarrassing and public, really made me question, you know, well, then who am I? If I'm not that, then who am I? And do I have standing if I'm not that guy? And I've struggled with that. You know, the question of who I'd be without that is not something that I've always answered well. And I have fallen on, you know, down on that question and struggled with it. But I think through faith and being more grounded in faith and humility and understanding that I can be humbled in lots of different ways, that I know where the real passion is. You know, I am a journalist. I am a father. I am a husband. But I'm also somebody who's created in the image of God and I think is held to account. And I'll add another quote, because I just read this before I came out with John. And before this turns into a revival meeting, I just want to do Richard Rohr writes about, and this is just like the first couple of pages, about your true self. This is for the front row here. I now need reading glasses, and they knew me when I was climbing around there. And he writes, your true self is that part of you that knows who you are and whose you are, although largely unconsciously. Your false self is just who you think you are, but thinking doesn't make it so. So I've had to deal with, you know, who I thought I was. And I've realized that there's great passion in knowing who I really am and what I can give. And how, you know, I would say a book tour is not the best thing for your spiritual journey because it's still a little too much focus on me. But if I can quiet that a little bit and still seek to have influence and still seek which is a calling for me of curiosity and to grow and to learn and to share and to try to be enlightening through journalism. I think that's where passion is. I think that's where need is. If I can be humble enough to understand that I'm an underdog, as David Brooks writes about humility, against my own weaknesses, and that I've got enough room to understand that, you know, I've got to spend some time serving others, then at least I'm on the path. You know, that I'm on the path, and I hope it's in the right direction.
David, it has been a real honor to have you here. And I want to say I know a great deal of your searching, and a lot of what you talked about tonight involves your own humility. And, what I would say is it is a wonderful thing to see someone of your extraordinary stature have a humbleness about them. But I also want to say, as a really interested observer, you've just done fantastic with this book, and it's a gift. It really is a gift to all of us, and we really appreciate you coming and for writing this book.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you that would like to say hello to David and get a copy of his book, he will be up in the gift store in about 1 minute. So if you would just allow him to pass through first.